Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of DGSIC, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all present, in particular to the speakers of this session and our esteemed chair. I would like to take this opportunity to briefly introduce the chair. Imain Gorgul is an associate professor and a tenured faculty of Istanbul Technical University School of Architecture, actively taking part both in graduate and undergraduate levels of architecture and interior architecture programs, and former vice chair of Department of Interior Architecture. She has received a BSc, MSc, and PhD degrees from ITU on architecture and architectural theory and criticism. Her master thesis focused on deconstructivism and avant-garde theory while dismantling the AG behavior in deconstructivism. Yet her PhD thesis, entitled Space as a Becoming, a discussion on transfiguring ontology of space and emergence of spatial mediators, also focused on the space as an open-ended dynamic embodiment and examined the architectural space through a Deleuzian context. She was a visiting researcher in Tretyakov Galleries and State Russian Museum, visiting scholar in DSD TU Delft, a visiting teacher at AA Architectural Association London VTP. She teaches not only design studios but also theoretical courses focusing on architecture theory and criticism, space and politics, gender and space, as well as design culture. She has authored numerous articles and book chapters both in Turkish and in English. With that said, I would like to welcome Professor Imain once again. The stage is all yours, Professor.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon for everyone from Istanbul. This is the second day of this grand marathon, and we're benefiting all around the world with this gorgeous event full of fruitful ideas. I also would like to extend my thanks to the organizers once again, dearest Manoj, as well as on behalf of him for everyone keenly putting great effort for this event. So on today's plenary session, I would like to introduce two eminent professors, Professor Dolphijn and Professoress Angelucci. So we will begin with Professor Dolphijn and then pursue with Professoress Angelucci. So I would like to give a brief information initially about Professor Dolphijn. Welcome you all. Dr. Dolphijn is an associate professor at Media and Culture Studies at Utrecht University, an honorary professor at Hong Kong University from 2017 till 2023, a visiting professor at the University of Barcelona, and his books include Foodscapes from University of Chicago Press, New Materialism, Interviews and Cartographies from Open Humanities University in collaboration with Professor Van der Twijn. And another publication of him again, The Philosophy of Matter, a Mediation from Bloomsbury, published in 2021. His academic work has appeared in journals like Continental Philosophy Review, Angelica, Rhizome, Collapse, and Deleuze Studies. He edited This Deleuzian Century, Art, Activism and Life with Professor Braidotti, and Philosophy After Nature. And most recently, his edited volume is Michael Serres and the Crisis of Contemporary, again from Bloomsbury. He is a principal investor in two international research projects. One is Food Together, from Hera-funded EU project, and Imagine from Norwegian Research Council. I would like to hand over the word to Professor Dolphijn. Over to you.
Unmute, yeah. Thank you very much, Emin, for this very kind introduction. Thank you, Manoj, for inviting me. Thank you for the whole community. I'm really honored and proud to be part of this, and I'm glad to see you all again, even if this is only online. Yeah, let's hope times change once again. Anyway, I would like to share my screen, and then as in terms of timing, I think I'm supposed to talk for half an hour, something like that. Is that okay?
Time of 40 minutes for each speaker. We can go up to 40 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Does this work? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I would like to talk about a project that I've been engaged in for the past year or something, and it's actually a really long text already, about 80-90 pages. So I'm doing a summary here. If there are more questions, and I'll of course be happy to answer them, and they all have to do with the politics of matter, and of course the arts play an important role in this. In the talk that I have prepared for today, I will focus on writings like novels and on cinema. Important addition is that when I talk about politics, I really talk about what happens in the city, so the polis, so not so much about the state. So in what way do we see a politics at work in the city, and how do you see art engaged in it? Of course, Deleuze plays a key role in my reading of this, which will prove now. The way I started my research is really by this book of Amitav Ghosh. I hope many of you have already read it. It's a fantastic book, The Great Derangement. It talks about climate change and the unthinkable, but very much it is a kind of aimed at writers, at authors of fiction books. Main claim is that the writers of fiction books, especially in the 20th century, all over the world, have become too human-centered and not so much troubled by the contemporary condition, and especially about the earth. Whereas he says that writing should be engaged, writing should be imaginative, and writing should be kind of in search for a kind of a speculative future. I completely agree with his point of view. At the same time, I see that this grand narrative is also just a grand narrative, as that there are loads of minor developments at work. And especially if you look at, you can call these a more than human perspective, and especially if you look at the books that are considered to be out of this world, and I'm thinking of sci-fi, of dystopian writings and superhero adventures, then you can see that there's actually a very different story going on, a much more engaged way of dealing with the world, which is of course interesting because they are usually put in the section fantasy as if they do not matter to what happens today. So what I want to do now is to say a bit of how this alternative way of looking at what novels do is of course rooted in what Deleuze and Guattari have to say. The Rhizome text, which we've all read 100 times, and I still don't understand it, is very much talking about what books do and what books can do. And I think it's important to keep in mind this the way in which Deleuze and Guattari keep stressing the way in which they talk about three different fields: the field of representation, the field of subjectivity, and the field of reality are enwoven in each other, and how a book is actually a kind of a force which actively engages very practically, very much kind of on the ground in creating forms of subjecty, in creating the world, and in also creating ideas of representation, of course. So this idea of that there's no outside of the book in that sense is I think really important. In line with that, was already mentioned, I'm also a big fan of the works of Michel Serres, Deleuze's friend of old age. Michel Serres keeps stressing that the distinction between fiction and non-fiction is a recent invention of academia. And of course, we should get rid of that distinction. So when Deleuze and Guattari talk of the way in which books are interwoven in the world and in authorship and in readership, of course, then this does not just say something about philosophy books. It says something about every book. So, yeah, two books that when I talk about politics, when I talk about the way in which the city works, are of the greatest importance, are a book by Fyodor Dostoevsky, not his most well-known book, but I would say a hugely influential book, especially in his time, and a book by Yevgeny Zamyatin. These two books, as said, are considered to be dystopian or whatever, but of course they are not at all. If you look at Dostoevsky's writing from Notes from the Underground, a year before he wrote this book, Dostoevsky visited Paris and he saw what Haussmann had done to Paris, which means closing up the city, creating the facades behind which so many different things could happen, but you didn't know. The facades all look the same. And that had a huge impact on the city, but also on what life in the city was all about, of course. So I would like to call that a more than human politics of the unseen. It's more than human because it involves the architecture, it involves the creation of the city. And Dostoevsky writes a philosophy book in the end on this, and tries to think about what it means to have a more than human politics of the unseen, and what this means for the city, and not so much for Paris, but kind of what the city is and what the city will become. So this very strong engagement with what the city is all about, I think it's extremely important, and it has a lot of influence, not just on representation, but also on how the city in itself entered into different forms of becoming. So the other book that is, of course, important is Zamyatin, who had a huge effect on the later works of Aldous Huxley and George Orwell and others. But Zamyatin's book was the first, and actually also it was really good. It's really well written. We first published in English, actually. It was written in the early 1920s already in Russia. First published in English in 1924. It really talks about the more than human politics of the scene. So very much about how St. Petersburg, by the way, in the PowerPoint, you see some little pictures of the cities that I'm talking about. First, there's Paris of Haussmann, and next to it, there's St. Petersburg in the 1920s, which was, of course, also taken over by the Soviet regime, and where this kind of the politics of the scene was really installed in the city. Everything was visible. The story itself is about the city of glass, and of course about one central government which controlled everything, as we can also see that in the later works of Huxley and others. But anyway, these are very important books about what the politics of the city is all about, and how we have to look at the city and see how the city evolved. of course, and this is also where the 20th century begins. Of course, there was cinema. First, actually, there was a book by Thea von Harbou, so the partner of Fritz Lang, called Metropolis. And this book was published 2 years before the film came out. The novel is pretty much the same story about Metropolis, about this city, very much talking about, of course, the new cities that were then emerging, being mainly New York and Chicago, but we could think of other cities too, of course. What you see in this, in the book and in the film, that they combine the two perspectives. So it is at the one time a politics of the unseen and a politics of the seen. There are dark and shady parts in the book, and very bright and illuminated parts. Obviously, of course, this comes with a type of Marxism. Interestingly enough, in the novel, the perspective is very much, well, you can call it existentialist, very much talking from a personal perspective, still humanist maybe in the end. But especially when you, and this was of course the great invention of cinema. When you look at the film, then these existentialist questions are not posed anymore. What you see in the film is that the play between the seen and the unseen is being done by light, by the movement of light. The hiding and revealing, as I say in the slide also, the hiding and revealing are now united in the play of light and dark. This is what cinema can do, of course. The new skyscraper city, the megalopolis, practices this cinematology. Skyscrapers populate the city and technologies operate it. It's also interesting to see how in cinema this notion of technology is also a very recent word, of course, as we all know, very much a 19th century concept. But especially in cinema, you can see that in the cinematographic eye, you can see that technologies became crucial. Paris and St. Petersburg are the cities of the book, and then New York and Chicago are the cities of cinema. I like the old term, which is actually also used in Dutch, my own native language, the term bioscope, which was also used in the English language for a long time, which really says that you're looking at life in when you go to a movie theater. Of course, Deleuze also talks about this. I mean, that's where I get my inspiration from. And when he talks about Metropolis, he talks about how shadows of houses pursue the man running along the street. So definitely in the film, you can see that the skyscrapers, the shadows and the lights of the skyscrapers and the technologies play a huge role. As said, the Marxism is too obvious. The high-rise apartments of the upper class, enlightened, spacious and clean, are contrasted with the overcrowded, dark and dirty alleys of the underworld. My claim is that the unseen city, the way in which not just Metropolis, but actually since then, so many of the films that are considered dystopian or sci-fi or even some superhero films, I will talk about that later, that they work with an idea in cinema, as Deleuze talked about this. And this idea, I would label that the unseen city. Felicity Coleman had already highlighted that Deleuze's project with cinema has all along been to engage it as the political media of the 20th century. And that means that for Deleuze, and especially in his cinema books, but also in this the lecture that I'm now actually referring to, the short online film that we all love very much, I think, because it's beautiful, in which he talks about the idea of cinema. It also shows that he says that cinema itself politicizes the event, which means that it is an ongoing way of seeing, which of course, I mean, he was inspired by Bergson in that. But in the cinema books, this is extremely well kind of laid out. And of course, the main short clip, the lecture that he gave at the film school in the 1980s, and that is that when he talks about the idea in cinema, he says that these ideas have to be treated like potentials already engaged, déjà engagés, in one mode of expression or another, and inseparable from the mode of expression, such that I cannot say I have an idea in general. It's very much in line, of course, with how he talks about the book when, together with Guattari, they wrote the rhizome text. Another term I find really inspiring also in this lecture, which is the cycle, which is my second point. So a cycle that suddenly makes cinema resonate with the qualitative physics of the elements. It produces a kind of transformation, a vast circulation of elements in cinema, starting with air, earth, water, and fire. So I've been very much interested in new materialism. It's always difficult to call myself a new materialist because I'm not a spokesperson or anything like that. I'm interested in what happens there. And I'm also interested to see in what way Deleuze time and again comes up with this kind of the materialisms when, for instance, he talks about cinema and the way in which cinema intervenes in that which matters. So here I would say the potentials already engaged and the cycles of sci-fi or dystopian cinema are the politics of the contemporary city. And the unseen city is the cinematographic strategy of those who run the city. And again, the kind of politics here is I would say really important. So another text that I've been reading a lot recently, so not just this text actually, but the whole work of Karatani is very inspiring, and also the way in which he rereads Marx, and to see how this is also in line with how Deleuze and Guattari, especially in Anti-Oedipe, talk about Marx. I think there's also has a lot to say about how we can think of a politics of the city and how books and cinema intervene in that. So I have this quote here from Karatani. When he talks about Marx, he stresses that this kind of sovereign, he talks about how power works. This kind of sovereign is not born from within the community through a process of self-alienation, which is still quite often claimed in Marxist publications, but rather originally comes from the outside. In other words, that the sovereign arrives as a conqueror. Very interesting idea that all kinds of sovereignty, he would say, are in the end coming from the outside. And then you can think of state politics, but also of capitalism. And I would say that really is in line with how Deleuze and Guattari, as said in Anti-Oedipe, talk of the death of the primitive system. So the system which was able to ward off capitalism. Of course, the powers were there already, and there was a blacksmith, there was a tradesman, but these were not allowed to dominate society. That somehow, coming from the outside, they actually did in the end. This, as I said, this is in Antiodiep. Deleuze-Guattari also mentioned this when talking about the rise of the state and of capitalism. The death of the primitive system always comes from without, they claim. And this is it's good to note that it's not completely alien. I mean, there is, of course, this force coming from the outside, but it was always already rising from within. So I think it's interesting to look at the city and to look at cinema as from this kind of Marxist perspective, and to see how, especially in the long 20th century, I take an expression from history. When they talk about the 19th century, they talk about the long 19th century, stopping at 1914. When we talk about the 20th century, you can also still perhaps talk about the 20th century up until, well, maybe 2019, because I guess that something has changed in the recent times when it comes to the cinematographic image and the dominance of cinematography in that sense. So the long 20th century expresses itself cinematically. Its skyscraper city, its capitalism, its states are cinematic. But in the end, this is just another articulation of capital. And what we see in books, movies, and cities is that power comes from the outside. Of course, it's interesting to see in what way these powers are being resisted, which already in the books by Dostoevsky and by Samyatin was a very prominent part of the narrative. So, in what way do people deal with these forces from the outside? When Deleuze talks of cinema, he uses terms like the jams or breaks of cinema in order to find out, and the jams or breaks in the visual, in order to find out how resistance can be thought of within this regime. So the jams and breaks of cinema and the long 20th century are the jams or breaks in the logic of the unseen. There's much written about that, of course, in the cinema books. So I said I'm kind of distilling this talk from a long piece of text in which I also speak a lot about Hong Kong. Unfortunately, although I still have my honorary professorship there, unfortunately, I haven't been able to travel there. No one has, I think, for the past 2 years now. But the last time I was there, of course, there was a lot going on, as we all know. And this was very interesting and sad, of course, for many different reasons. But also interesting from a cinematographic perspective, and to see in what way resistance took place, and in what way the visual, the seen and the unseen were at work in that resistance. So the photos I share here are all taken by myself. It was taken, as said, in October 2019. Hong Kong is a very interesting city also when it comes to cinema, of course, because I was just referring to Chicago and New York being kind of cinematographic cities since the 1920s, but since the 1970s, of course, Hong Kong has been a very important part of it. And I would say that, actually I put it right in the slide, Hong Kong belonging to cinema since the 1970s. Was increasingly dominated by capital and by the rules from outside. especially since the 1970s and the 1980s. And it's, of course, this is no coincidence. Cinema, but also capital and also the state got more and more powerful in Hong Kong and kind of created this city, created the enormous amount of skyscrapers. Hong Kong has twice the amount of skyscrapers as New York, so this is a lot. Yeah, there are so many films that kind of take place in Hong Kong, or that James Bond, for some reason, always has to visit Hong Kong whenever he is at work. Yeah, the cracking of that image and the way in which this has changed in 2019 especially is interesting. It was the time when this new film Joker came out, and actually a few days after it was released, we could already see images of the Joker kind of in the public domain. As said, there were a lot of protests, and there was an enormous amount of art going on in the streets of Hong Kong. And as you can see here, this is a photo I took myself. There were stickers everywhere using the image of Joker, and of course of so many other. I mean, I have some photos next to it also of all the other images that were used. But it very much had to do with the seen and the unseen, and with kind of notes from the underground and of the glass city. So that all came together there in various ways. Capitalism, of course, as you can see also, and the state. The image of the Joker was especially intriguing because of the masks, of course, and because of the way in which these masks played with the seen and the unseen. Yeah, I actually have quite a long analysis of how this happened in Hong Kong and what this means, using a lot of Deleuze's reading of cinema and of resistance. So 2 quotes here. First of all, the lower one, the act of resistance has 2 faces. It is human, but it's also an act of art. I think that was all too obvious. I can go 1 slide back. When you look at what happened in the cities of Hong Kong, I will show you some more pictures later on, actually. That it was such a creative environment, which was all of a sudden created, which was all of a sudden established. Very much the visual in many ways. So the streets were kind of taken over, and yeah, in many ways cracked by the different forms of resistance. So I like this idea of having 2 faces, the human and the act of art. They function together in that sense. Then the upper quote is saying us a lot about about resistance, how this happens in cinema, and how this perhaps also should be seen in the cities of today. We are still thinking, right, when we talk about resistance, we hope for some type of revolution, but I guess that the type of revolution that we are that we have in our dictionaries is kind of outdated. And Deleuze has this very nice idea of how we need to rethink the notion of revolution. I'm going to read this out. They say revolutions turn out badly. He's talking about 1968, of course. But they're constantly confusing 2 different things: the way revolutions turn out historically, and people's revolutionary becomings. These relate to 2 different sets of people. Man's only hope lies in a revolutionary becoming. The only way of casting off their shame or responding to what is intolerable. So I think that in cinema, especially, you can see that also in the novels that I talked about, but especially in cinema, you can see this in terms of the seen and the unseen. This kind of revolutionary becoming is extremely important and is kind of the narrative of the film. And Joker, in that sense, is a very nice example of how this takes place, and also how this takes place in a very artful way. The amount of dancing in the film is, I don't know if you've seen it, but the amount of dancing in the film is important. And of course, the way in which this Arthur Fleck, the main character, transforms during the film has a lot to do with resistance as an act of art, as an act of reinventing oneself. As said, the Joker itself is also, of course, a very good example of how the city is kind of dominating the narrative of the film, because in many ways the capitalism and actually all forms of power that are dominant in that particular film are also kind of I mean, that's what happens in the screen. It takes place in New York, the Bronx mainly, in the 1980s. Rundown area, rubbish in the streets always, bad working environments, and you can see that throughout the film that Arthur Fleck, similar to how this works in other so-called dystopian films, Arthur Fleck is kind of manipulated and subjected to these different forms of seen and unseen powers. And shadows play an important role in the film too. And of course, through the skyscrapers and the technologies which do not work with Arthur Fleck, but do work with the other characters in the film. So there are some other images, as I mentioned, from Hong Kong in 2019. And you can see how visual this revolution was, or better, how visual this revolutionary becoming and these various revolutionary becomings were. Very much reaching out to the world, very much talking in images, occupying the streets in that sense. Yeah, when Deleuze talks of cinema, he talks a lot about in the end that the people are missing, and that an audience must be invented. And especially if you look at images like these, you can see that whatever you saw in the news of the protests, sometimes the cameras were always at the point where the protesters met with the police, but this was the everyday reality, where you could see the images everywhere, and the images were waiting for an audience and searching for ways to intervene in the realities of the day. And I think that's a very interesting way of seeing how this city, a necessary way of seeing how the city as a cinematographic project of the 20th century is at work, and how in the end we should kind of rethink our ideas of cinema and our ideas of literature, according to how Deleuze and Guattari, for instance, talk of the cinematographic. So I think I'm almost at the end of my time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for this insightful presentation, though you have 4 more minutes, but You're perfectly fine. Thank you so much. So maybe we can use this duration on the Q&A. It's great. I would like to pursue with the second presenter. Shall we? So Professor Angelucci is an associate professor of aesthetics at the University of Rome, Tre. Her early work is on phenomenological aesthetics and philosophy of literature. Her main interests are philosophy of film and literature, contemporary philosophy, psychoanalysis. She is the co-director of postgraduate course Environmental Humanities at the University of Roma Tre, a Department of Philosophy and Department of Architecture. She is vice president of Società Italiana di Estetica. She is advisor for aesthetics, philosophy, and cinema for Istituto della Enciclopedia Italiana, Treccani. In 2016, she organized the 9th Deleuze Studies International Conference and annual camps in Rome. She has participated in numerous national and international conferences. Professor Angelucci's books are Filosofia del Cinema, Carocci in Rome, from Carocci, Rome in 2013, Deleuze and Concepts of Cinema from Edinburgh University Press in 2014. And recent editions, Philosophical Essay on Espelosso's Art and Cinema, in collaboration with Professor Sasso from Cambridge Scholars Publishing in 2018. Deleuze in Italy, Deleuze and Guattari Studies in 2019. Estetica, Arte e Vita, in collaboration with Professor Oliva, in 2020. So I would like to hand over to Professor Angelucci. Prego.
Thank you very much, Emine. Thank you for this introduction, and good morning from Rome, from Italy. I would like to thank, first of all, Manoj and the organizers for this incredible effort of organization all around the world. So thank you, Manoj. Okay, my talk will be about philosophy and art, and the concept of life in itself. It's something more theoretical and less aesthetical, because the constant idea of Deleuze's bodies of work is that there is a powerful, non-organized, non-organic life imprisoned by the forms of representations, of institution. And the attempt of philosophy is to go beyond this form of imprisonment, to explore life in itself, in its immanence. So I will try to start from 3 questions, because this statement brings with it 3 questions. First one: how can we get in touch with vital forces freed from any representation, we human? Second, what role does art play in grasping life, understood not as living experience, individual experience, but as the perception of non-human force, as Rick said just before? Third question, this contact with vital forces freed from any representation is completely, totally desirable or not? I would like to say also that these questions are more and more important today for contemporary humanity, which on the one hand must come to terms with a new necessary relationship with non-human living beings, a relationship that, as we all know, could be also very conflictual, and on the other hand, is reacting to this necessity by closing itself off more and more from the unpredictability of encounters of life. So the theme of life in itself is present in practically all Deleuze's texts, either alone or with Guattari, where the concept of life appears under various forms. Body without organs, the concept of virtual, the concept of event. I would say also the question of time image is something that has to do with the vital forces that erupt from an ordinary ontology. Today, I would like to focus on what is philosophy, the last book published by Deleuze before his death, where they, Deleuze and Guattari, write about immanence and chaos. So first point, how can we get in touch with vital forces freed from representation? The beginning of what is philosophy, trying to answer the question of the title, what is philosophy, pointing up the issue of chaos. Chaos is described as a virtual field, a state which is not indefinite nor confused, but rather characterized by the continuous movement of fugacity. Chaos is pure becoming, is life without order, without organization. It is the perpetual movement of life, not as living experience, but life in itself, life without individualization. Just a short quotation. Chaos is defined not so much by its disorder as by the infinite speed with which every form taking shape in it vanishes. It is a void that is not a nothingness, but a virtual, containing all possible particles and drawing out all possible forms, which spring up only to disappear immediately, without consistence or reference. So, if chaos is a virtuality defined not much by confusion, but rather by a fugacity, so that that is something which does not allow any relationship between determination, between single determinations. Philosophy has the task of giving consistence to all these determinations without transforming them in something different, without actualizing them, and without renouncing to virtuality and infinity. So the answer to the question, what is philosophy, is that philosophy is one of the form of thought that tries to give some consistency to the chaos of life in itself, in particular through concepts. With science and art, philosophy is one of the possible forms of struggle against chaos of becoming. It is a struggle that must lead to an order, to a composition, but without distorting the characteristic and the perpetual movement of life. Cross-cutting chaos without stopping its movement, the movement of life, also means instituting what Deleuze and Guattari call the plane of immanence, as we all know, recalling a concept by Spinoza. So in these pages, it is apparent the effort to delimit this figure of thought, the plane of immanence, because these pages are full of definitions ex negativo. The plane of immanence is neither a method nor a set of knowledge. About the functioning of the brain, for example. It is not an opinion one might have about thought, nor a kind of concept of all the concepts. The plane of immanence is rather, I'm quoting, the image of thought, the image thought gives itself of what it means to think. So it is an image constituted by an infinite movement and I would say horizontality, and by a superficial becoming which does not imply any transcendence. So let me use other words more radical and maybe clearer. The problem is how think life as becoming and immanence without introducing elements of transcendence and of representation. Elements that can stop the becoming of life in itself. So we are dealing, Deleuze and Guattari, but we all today are dealing with a task, the task of inhabiting in the immanence of the surface and of the becoming that is unavoidable in one sense, but at the same time almost impossible. In fact, another quotation, transcendence enters as soon as movement of the infinite is stopped. It takes advantage of the interruption to re-emerge, revive, and spring forth again. After all, it seems that we are faced with an out-out, either transcendence or pure unthinkable chaos. The thought that refutes a transcendent order is a perennial struggle, and the question whether it is possible not to succumb to chaos gets transformed, whether it might exist a plane able to think pure immanence without imitating anything transcendent. Philosophy has the apparently more modest, task of, a quotation, not so much to think the plane of immanence, but as to show that it is there. I highlight the verb show instead of think because they use an aesthetical term. It's something that is showed in the book. I propose a very short digression about Lacan, the psychoanalyst Lacan. I know that explaining Deleuze through Lacan is a little ambitious and maybe delirious, but I will try because I think that some ideas of Lacan can help us to understand the question of immanence. I hope that Eva is there because she's really familiar with Lacan. Yes. Okay. Hi, Eva. So for who knows Lacanian thought, I believe that the concept of chaos, of life without a form, seems similar to what Lacan, during the last part of his teaching, called the real, with a capital R. In his theory, Lacan describes the real as a register connected to two others, imaginary, that is imagination, self-awareness, the image of the others, and symbolic, that is language in a very large sense. It's, I would say, the field of the law, of the symbolization, the cultural system in general. The three registers of human life are reciprocally connected in a Borromean note composed of these three rings interlocking each other. So every dimension can't be experienced without the others. So my point, the Lacanian point, is that real is not the same of reality. If reality is the world seen through our faculties of imaginary and symbolic, actually the real is what places itself beyond reality, something obscure, something that Lacan called elusive, complex, intangible, and resisting to meaningful formulations. So in our ordinary experience, we perceive our own world in a representation that makes the real manageable, under control, tamed by our representations. So talking about the Deleuzian-Guattarian immanence in a Lacanian way, that is the question of what is philosophy, thinking the immanence, the life in itself, is how is possible to have a contact with the real, going maybe just for a moment beyond symbolic and imaginary, and without provoking a total dissolution. This idea of dissolution is an idea that Deleuze and Guattari propose also in Mille Plateaux, with talking about one of the danger run by the line of flight. The first danger is that one of the realization, but there is also the danger of a dissolution of the line of flight. So coming back to Deleuze and Guattari, I already said that among the ways in which thought faces chaos, the authors do not mention only philosophy, but also science and art. The specific content of philosophy are concepts, that the one of science is function, and the one of art, the composition of sensible aggregates. These three forms of creativity, I would say, are associated by the drive to face chaos, but this does not mean, however, an indiscriminate fusion of the three forms of creativity. They are resonant activities that meet because all should solve the very same problem with their specific instruments, which are thus the difference between philosophy and art in the way of tackling the dimension of life in itself. So I will put aside science for today, or maybe forever. Okay, philosophy, by sifting the virtuality of chaos, establishes a plane, I already said that, and proposes some concept giving consistence to what was indeterminate. The challenge is doing this without abandoning the level of virtuality and immanence, that is, without renouncing the infinite becoming. But what about art? How does art intervenes on chaos, on life? In What is Philosophy, surprisingly, Deleuze and Guattari define the main feature of art, that of preservation. This statement seems paradoxical from an author known for his concept of life as becoming, pure becoming, but such definition of the task of art as preservation has an important goal. Art is the production of a block of sensations which gain immediate independence from their model, from the eventual user as well as from the artist. The work of art becomes self-standing and self-conserved, also when the subject who felt such sensations does not exist anymore. In other terms, affirming the auto-positioning of the work of art, its self-standing character, means in the first place refuting the idea of art as an experience dependent on a subject. This block of sensations is in fact not composed of perception and affection, but rather of percepts and affects, that is, sensations and sentiment that are independent and completely free from any subjective lived experience. A more than human perspective, as Rick was talking about before. Just a short quotation. By means of the material, the aim of art is to wrest the percept from perceptions of objects and the states of a perceiving subject, to wrest the affect from affections as the transition from one state to another, to extract a block of sensations, a pure being of sensation. So art, literature in particular, as Rick said before, cinema is a little different. Literature in particular coexisted for a long time with the ambiguity characterizing their narrated contents, as if they were simply recollections or lived experience. Deleuze and Guattari, through the invention of percepts and affects, insisted in defending the idea of art as something always exceeding living experience, always exceeding memory. Art, literature is something able to see beyond and often glimpse something intolerable. I would say to see beyond the living experience, foreseeing life in itself, or in a Lacanian way, beyond the reality, foreseeing the real with capital R. So between the author and characters, there would be no identification, no affinity, but a sort of odd closeness, this zone of indiscernibility and indetermination, which can be accounted only through the transfer of self-positing sensations. Art inhabits these zones of transfer between author and characters, between the characters and the domains in which they live, and among characters themselves. So if this peculiar contiguity characterizes the aesthetical figures as sorts of becoming, the becoming other of art is rather different from the becoming of the philosophical concept. Art embodies the event, including it in the matter through which it is expressed. The idea is always in a perspective, in a direction. It is expressed and incorporating it into sensibility, so to build a frame, a plane of composition in which integrating it. The work of art is a block of sensation in which there still is an opening to the world. Short quotation from What is Philosophy. it still needs a vast plane of compositions that carries out a kind of deframing following lines of flight that pass through the territory only in order to open it onto the universe. The aesthetical composition does not come prior to sensation nor after it. Rather, the two are complementary, since the one can exist only in virtue of the other. The composed sensation of percepts and affects, free from subjectivity, gets reterritorialized in a composition, resulting in a deterritorialization of a higher order. With the opening, the escapes typical of the work of art. So these two terms, deterritorialization and reterritorialization, often abused in Deleuze and Guattari readings, are important here for their capacity to propose at the same time an idea of horizontality and movement, composition and new opening. Using maybe too much solemn words, one might say that art restores the infinite infinitude, since on the one side it does not renounce by establishing a relationship with the virtual, while on the other side it can indulge in a break into finitude by embodying the event as something, a work, a composition. The different routes of thought, philosophy, science, and art, represent different ways of instituting what Deleuze and Guattari, reprising a term coined by James Joyce in Finnegan's Wake, label as chaosmos, that is chaos and cosmos. And I highlight that Joyce is another thing that Deleuze and Lacan have in common, because Lacan titled a seminar Joyce les symptômes, writing just about the real. Okay, so chaosmos is an order which, however, keeps in touch with the infinite variation of chaos. Art does not cross the plane of virtuality and becoming as philosophy does, but rather deterritorialize and reterritorialize. That is, it allows a leap guiding the artist from chaos into the organization of aesthetic composition, a composition which anyway remains always open. In this struggle against chaos of life, a struggle to make it sensible, chaos is not dispelled, but rather incarnated and illuminated for a glimpse. So differently from what is often thought about Deleuze philosophy, the idea that the proposal of an affirmative thinking is something like everything goes well. Such definition of art as capacity for an encounter with the unthinkable highlights the violence of a non-dialectical encounter. That is also the apparent legacy of Nietzsche. The aesthetic experience is characterized as the possibility of a contact, sometimes traumatic, surely non-pacifying, with an otherwise unthinkable dimension. Obviously, I don't mean the artistic experience here as a separate experience. I would say something bourgeois, a bourgeois experience. For example, something to do on Saturday afternoon at the museum, but as something that can affect our lives and changes them. Another short psychoanalytical digression to come back to Lacan. If the concept of real can be close to that one of immanence, here about art and the idea of art, there is a difference. Lacan in Seminar 11 presents art as a moment that can tame, can domesticate the gaze of the viewer, something not provocative, not transgressive, but pacifying. Okay, I think that this is not the definitive idea of Lacan about art, but a lot of contemporary psychoanalysts in Italy insist on the idea of art as something harmonic. On the contrary, the Deleuzian idea of glimpsing something intolerable implies a violence. The idea that such fight against chaos doesn't end with a pacific composition, a harmonic composition. At the end of the book, Deleuze and Guattari insist on the equality of the different forms of thought in this struggle against chaos. Quotation, however, they say, they wrote, art should not be thought to be like a synthesis of science and philosophy, of the finite and the infinite roots. The three roots are specific, each as direct as the others. I would like to contradict the same authors, stating that art shows itself at least as the most feasible way to compose an experience of immanence, of life in itself, not sublimating it. Precisely because it is struggle, in this struggle, art has, a quotation, an affinity with its enemy. That one of being a block of sensation. So my suggestion is that art is the most feasible way to brush against ideas and sensation which are usually dispersed without, however, succumbing them or without transforming them in something different. Even if art is neither the most direct form of thought nor the most synthetic one, it is still the most capable, frequented, feasible route to approach life in itself, according to the Deleuzian idea of impersonal life without organization, without organs. If I have just another 5 minutes, the third part, the conclusion, I titled the conclusion Virus Life, because this is the background, the constant background of my talk about the possibility of a contact with chaos, with life in itself. And my question was if this contact is really desirable. A certain psychoanalysis, that one, for example, of Laplanche, a Freud scholar, calls this dimension the sexual with capital S, meaning a sexuality that Freud would have defined perverse and polymorphous, and an organized pleasure principle. But the sexual brings with it disorder, danger, along with vitality. The point is that a total abandonment to this dimension leads to dissolution, reuniting with Thanatos, but also that without sexual, without chaos, there is no life. So returning to Deleuzian language, a contact with the vital forces in itself, released from any representative scheme, is vitalizing maybe, and at the same time disturbing, is something that brings disorder. In Emile Plateau, the line of flight, the exit from a closed territory, always runs the risk of dissolution. So the question is this a risk that must be taken? I anticipate that my answer is yes, in a sense. What I'm talking about has gained a new concreteness in our lives in recent years. The virus as a product of encounters and clashes between bodies, between different species in a materialist perspective, is not only a fact, but an event in a Deleuzian sense. And this idea of talking about the virus as an event teaches us to always keep in mind the disturbing aspect of a thought of immanence, of a materialism of immanence. The Deleuzian thought is a thought of optimism, but of a desperate optimism, capable of saying no, of resisting and confronting what resists thought. The Deleuzian idea of life as a continuous metamorphosis, of which the virus is an obvious example, are at the same time liberating and aggressive, transformative and disturbing. And it is life in itself that is disturbing and ambiguous. But in this possibility of disorder lies also the potential for creation, for invention, for a new order, a new perspective, a new way of existing. But obviously, in every opening to the unprecedented, the unpredictable, there is an obscure and destructive part, which must be thought about, questioned, taken as a possibility of transformation, at the same time avoiding dissolution. So I would like to conclude my talk saying that we must come to terms with a necessary relationship with non-human living beings, a relationship that, as we all know now, can be also very conflictual as a struggle, a war, but also avoiding to close ourselves off more and more from the unpredictability of encounters and life. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think, I would like to extend my gratitude to the presenters for their insightful presentations, both, and also to the organizers crafting such a lineup that, booms our thoughts where they resonate a lot. So I would like to use the time properly and fruitfully. So I would like to return to the audiences and take their questions or remarks. Geoff, would you like to start? As I see it on the chat zone, you comment to Rick, and would you like to or carry on, or if no, then I ask for the audiences to unmute themselves and go ahead for their remarks. Okay. So maybe I can begin if everybody wants to warm up for a while. So I'm really fascinated when Rick, you were showing the pictures from Hong Kong Q, and being as an architect, so the city and politics is also my interest it's always living in a city like Istanbul. So it was so fascinating how you represent us the visibility of the invisible through the events of the Hong Kong Q, from the demonstrations in Hong Kong, and with overlap with the theoretical background. So I'm so much fascinated with this. Another question would be, this was a remark to you, but my question was to Daniela, but then she replied, I was, a question light up on my mind about what about the event at the end, but then you position that also in your presentation, you addressed that also in your presentation. I'm really fascinated with the presentations a lot. Any further questions from the audiences? Not much, I guess.
Maybe George would.
Yes, I think so.
George, I can't hear you. Unmute yourself, please.
He's unmuted, I guess.
But yeah, there's some audio problem from his side.
I mean, if you like, you can write and I can read, George, if you prefer. No sound.
George, maybe you should go out and come back again so that it can fix.
Maybe.
There's a question in the chat box, I
can read from Gray. I wonder if you could both clarify a bit the implications of art and chaos. I would like to tag it to the presenters, each by each. Maybe Rick, you start.
Yeah, thank you. The implications of art and chaos. Yeah, that's a big one. And I like to add also the term life, which the other speaker was also referring to so much, the way in which art in many ways also becomes bigger than life and finds a way to surpass time and space in that sense, also to kind of to stay urgent and to stay kind of vital in that sense. Yeah, the chaos, I guess, also looking at parts of my presentation still, which are on another screen in front of me. Of course, there's a lot of chaos, as in rearrangements and questioning of order. I think that in so many of the books that I also mentioned, and I'm now particularly thinking of Yamzatin's We, there's so much analysis of how order, which is of course in this book crucial, that order must be maintained, that there's so much meditation almost on how order, like the most simple order, he talks about 2 + 2 is 4. How can there not be any form of resistance within this simple form of order? How can there not be any form of chaos in that sense of breaking the logic? Yeah, especially Zamyatin is very sharp in that, in kind of how there's always this necessity of art, as in the creative intervention in any form of order also. So I like that thought, of course.
Maybe we can extend the same question to Daniela.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Yes, in my talk, I was referring to the idea of chaos in What is Philosophy, and it is in this text, chaos is another way to talk about life as becoming life in itself, not life, individual life or subjective life or experienced life. And in this particular sense, it is something that points to the idea of fugacity, of movement. The author wrote that philosophy, science, and art are three ways, three forms of struggling with against chaos, because we need, this is almost a quotation, we all need order, and this seems something too moderate for Deleuze and Guattari. But the idea is that for a new deterritorialization, it is important to propose also a moment of composition. And in my talk, I propose this idea that among these three forms of thought, art seems, I said, the most feasible, the most frequented, the most possible for all, for everyone, to trying this operation of grasping chaos, life, immanence, without renouncing of its becoming, its movement, its possibility to go beyond. And about the concept of another thing, this relationship between art and chaos seems to me more feasible, also because Deleuze and Guattari, the authors, the same authors, write that art has a sort of affinity with its enemy. The enemy is chaos in this, in a sense. There is an affinity, that one of the sensible aggregation. So in this dynamic between deterritorialization and reterritorialization, art is successful in this task to not succumb to another transcendent level, another introduction of a criteria from the outside of the sensible in a materialistic way. And about the question of event, Emine, it's really a big question. In particular, Deleuze write about it in Logic of Sense, where event is the possibility of introduce the idea, diciamo, a not corporeal element in the Stoic materialistic perspective. So the word is encounters of bodies, and the event is something really close to these bodies, but not really separated, but different. And this is the dimension of thought. And I think that the event of virus is now something like that for all of us. It's a fact, but is also something that gained a sort of dimension of thought that we have to elaborate. So I am, maybe you all have read about a lot of Agamben text about virus in Italy. The Italian philosopher Agamben, that wrote a lot of text saying that against the securitarian devices and so on. I don't agree with him about a lot of his statements, but that's true that if it's not desirable to produce a sort of application of ready-made theories to the virus, it is also important to make an event of the virus. That is to think about it in all together in a collective perspective.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe we can try George one more time.
Am I audible now?
Yes, great.
Okay.
Over to you. Yes.
Yeah. My question goes to Rick Dolphijn. He's speaking about space in cinema. If you take an evolutionary sort of progression in that sense, of course, Charles Chaplin's London becomes very important. I mean, like what you speak about Petersburg. But the real evolution of space in cinema actually then moves from all these cities to studios. I mean, the studios actually start trying to set the space, whatever kind of things you can see, studios can do that. And actually the industry's main movement is actually to the studios. And from studios, now it is coming out. Or you can say studios becoming cities, like Hollywood and Los Angeles. Or you can take like India, Mumbai and Bollywood. Or now Hyderabad and Ramoji city, because Ramoji city becomes the real city. So everyone who goes there visits that cities also. And now we don't know where the city is, like with Avatar and all the science fiction. So space becomes much more complex. Or like in the case of cinema, maybe at one phase, the early, like the Stavics is social realism. Of the early part, this maybe you can identify city. But after that, the evolution is so complicated. A studio that becomes probably a simulacrum, but a simulacrum itself now becoming the real, like a Disneyland in Orlando. I mean, you can have a lot of cases like that. Cinema constructing the city, not the other way. So what's your opinion about that?
I agree with the analysis that cinema creates the city, especially the kind of movies that I was interested in. The movies that did always already involve with the environment and about rethinking the environment. And very often they've been said to kind of focus on what is not actually in this world, as if this was purely fantasy. But I think that there are so many cases, and I'm just using a few examples, but I'm sure that there, in many different countries, there are examples of how the city has actually completely restaged what the city looks like. I'm not just talking about Times Square, but in all the cities of the 20th century, the kind of reshaping has taken place according to the eye and according to very kind of hierarchical idea of what vision in the end should be. So I think there's actually much more to analyze. I'm just scratching the surface here on how important our cinematographic vision has become for understanding what it means to live in a city and what city life is all about, and how the politics of the city have changed over the past 100 years.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you for this comment.
Thank you. Any other comments, Eva? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for this possibility of a short comment and question. Actually, I was really, overwhelmed by the two presentations of yours. Rick, it was so nice to see how it would be possible to perhaps introduce or reintroduce Marx in the whole field of the cinematic studies, and to go back to the issue of Deleuze and Marx once again, perhaps also a new reading of Anti-Oedipus from that perspective. I reintroduced I teach philosophy at the Ljubljana University, and this year I reintroduced the course on Marxism and critical theory, and I'm going to use your ideas, if I may. Next week. And also, Daniela, it was so nice to hear you saying that I know I shouldn't be speaking about Lacan here, but anyway, I'm going to do it. Because you can imagine me coming from Ljubljana, the Ljubljana Lacanian school, and whatever I say here in Ljubljana is, the reaction would be, oh, but she's a Deleuzian, which I'm not, of course, and Deleuze was not a Deleuzian anyway. But I would very much like to go along these lines of, not too quickly combining Lacan or Deleuze or whatever, and to go beyond the overwhelming idea, of the Lacanians and my friends from the Lacanian school, how to appropriate Deleuze and to show that Deleuze is actually Lacan all the way, And this, I think it was, for me, it was so inspiring, Daniela, that you started to take a concept from Lacan and then a concept from Deleuze and Guattari. So you have the real in Lacan and the immanence in Deleuze-Guattari studies or whatever. And you really tried hard to make something out of it. I think this is a wonderful way of doing it. And I would like to join you in a very near future in one of our sessions, perhaps. Perhaps we should call it Deleuze, Guattari, and Lacan dialogues or something like that. Thank you so much.
I totally agree, Eva. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. We have great feedbacks and connections, future connections. So we have still 5 more minutes to pursue the Q&A or remarks and vocalize the thoughts. Any further? I think maybe we can wrap up in here. So it's such a wonderful session. So I'm so much also influenced a lot with the ideas. So thank you so much for the presenters one more time, and sending virtual applauses over here. Okay. Then we'll see you in